Hello, LAPCS scholars. Mr. Raleigh and Miss Marks here. All right, so we are giving you the notes for Monroe and the era of good feelings, and this is just part one. So make sure you are taking notes and doing the comprehension questions. Make sure that you are using the worksheet that Miss Marks and I provided to you. Okay, so if you don't have that, make sure you get it. Okay, so President Monroe and the Era of Good Feelings, Part 1. The election of 1816. So if you look at this graph, it shows that Monroe won a vast majority of the votes, which is quite impressive. This also continued the so-called Virginia dynasty because a bunch of the presidents like Washington and Jefferson came from Virginia. It shows government officials from all areas of the nation and from both parties. Traditionally, up to this point, it was centered around Virginia and/or Philadelphia or Connecticut areas. Led to a vibrant nationalism that superseded partisan politics for a time. Think about what that means. Nationalism means that people had pride in the country and superseded partisan politics. In other words, politics wasn't as important for a time. Took a goodwill tour. I cannot read that. Oh, okay. He took a goodwill tour of the country in 1818 and was acclaimed by all sections. So what that means is that the president was going around the country, and this was the first time the president ever did that. And we may have some barking dogs. Okay, there's a picture of the man himself, Mr. President Monroe. Monroe's election in 1816 helped lead to the end of the Federalist Party. Remember, that was the party that had to do with John Adams and Washington. Federalists' liabilities or problems that they had included disloyalty during the War of 1812 because they were against it, extremely sectional regarding the interests of New England. Jefferson had adopted many of their most important ideas, such as Hamilton's financial plan, expanding the country, loose construction in certain cases. That said, ironically, Federalists reversed many of their initial positions, which is never a good thing for a political party to change positions. Originally nationalistic, it now opposed Republican nationalism. In other words, another word for that would be patriotism. Became strict constructionists, especially regarding internal improvements. So building up buildings and bridges and roads in the country. Era of Good Feelings was somewhat of a misnomer. Serious issues were beginning to divide the nation. So the Second Bank of the United States was an issue. The tariff of 1816, internal improvements, the sale of public lands, the Panic of 1819, the Missouri Compromise, the second party system. Now, all of those things we're going to get into in greater detail. Until then, I want you to do this comprehension check. What are 3 of the serious issues that began to divide the nation during the era of good feelings? So I want you to think about that. Take a moment, answer it, go back a little bit. Okay, and then you answer on your worksheet that was provided to you. Okay, so the era of good feelings was the so-called era of good feelings began after a long period of political and cultural strife. There was a lot of chaos in the country. The Revolutionary War, the constitutional debates, and the War of 1812 have been cultural staples for Americans for so long. The relative peace and prosperity of the post-war of 1812 time period brought out feelings of relative stability for the average American, which impacted literature at the time. And once we start talking about literature, who better to talk about that than Miss Marks? Take it away.
Hey guys, I'm excited to be on a video with Mr. Rally. It's kind of cool. So a lot of the questions that I'm going to be posing to you are also on that worksheet that Mr. Rally talked about, so make sure that you have that in front of you. So we're entering into a literary time period known as Romanticism. And we study that in conjunction with history because literature always reflects the time period in which people are living. So the literary time period before this that happened during the Revolutionary War was called the Enlightenment. And it was called that because people were being enlightened, or knowledge was coming to their brains about the importance of logic and freedom and science. So Mr. Rally, you can, that's okay. So the Enlightenment literature was all very factually based. We saw that, right? We read Common Sense and it used a lot of facts and persuasion techniques. We saw that in the Constitution. So there was no fiction. And you remember that fiction is stories that are made up and are mostly for fun. None of that existed, but that makes a lot of sense because as a country, we were really focused and very serious because a war was going on. People were dying. So we didn't really have time for fun and games. We had to be very serious. However, like Mr. Rowley was talking about, the war is over now, and there's prosperity going on in the country, and people are starting to feel more at ease, which means that their literature is also going to change. So now that the war is over, people actually have time on their hands to start creating things and thinking about more fun and interesting and beautiful things. So with that idea in mind, on your worksheet, I want you to take a minute and use your predicting skills. If people are now calm and excited about life, what are some different themes or things that they might be writing about during the Romantic time period? So go ahead, use your predicting skills and answer that on your worksheet. All right. So every literary time period has different characteristics. As I mentioned before, the Enlightenment was all about logic, freedom, persuasion. These are the 5 characteristics of Romanticism. There's an emphasis on beauty, because again, we're starting to think about beautiful things. We have time to do that. We're going to start to see figurative language. You know what that is. Things like similes, metaphors, hyperboles. And we're actually going to see adjectives. People are going to start describing things in their writing. You're going to see spiritual and supernatural events, much like we saw in our Native American creation myths. All of a sudden, things like ghosts and goblins are going to start coming into the literature and other spiritual or supernatural things. There's a really big emphasis on nature because nature is beautiful. And now people actually have time to be out in nature and enjoying it because it's not being blown up during a war. And the last thing that you're going to see is kind of a movement away from logic. People aren't going to be thinking logically as much or trying to persuade people, but instead they're going to focus on their feelings, their emotions, and there is actually the rise of romance. We're not going to read any romance novels in class, but this is where they actually did start to happen during the Romantic time period. Now, Gothicism is probably one of my favorites. Gothicism is not different than Romanticism. It just lives kind of under it a little bit. So it's a subgenre. It exists within Romanticism, but it's just like a little bit of a different branch. The reason it's still romantic literature is it focuses on the supernatural, it focuses on ghosts. It also is very full of adjectives. It's very descriptive, but the reason it has its own title is because it's very dark. I want to be clear though, it is not horror. This is not where like Chucky or clowns or crazy things like that. That's not where this comes from. Horror is bloody and gory and scary. This is just very dark. It's sometimes scary, but it's more like creepy. We're going to specifically be looking at Edgar Allan Poe, if that kind of focuses your mind on what I'm talking about. So it's not bloody. It's not about like murder and death and terrifying things like we think about for Halloween. It's more about dark, ghosts, goblins, and kind of scary things that happened during the time period. So we're going to focus more on that difference though when we actually read a Gothic piece of literature. All right, so really quickly, I just want to focus on 3 authors. And the reason I'm even taking time to tell you about the authors is because just like literature happens because of what's happening in history at the time, the same thing is true of authors. Authors write about what's going on in their personal lives. So understanding the life of an author helps you understand what he's writing about. So the first author is Washington Irving. That's a picture of him. He was born in New York. That is important because all of his stories take place in New York. That's how he writes. Wrote mostly essays and short stories, but what he's really famous for is something that since Halloween kind of just passed, you're probably familiar with. He wrote The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. It's kind of like fantastic, like it was made into a movie and whatnot, but it actually started as a story. This is just a fun fact, but I thought it was cool because I love superheroes. He actually was the first person to make the name Gotham for New York City, like we see in Batman. So he is going to be, you might have an option of reading one of his short stories. But our next author is Nathaniel Hawthorne, who's one of my personal favorite authors. Not that that matters. He's really exciting because he was born in Salem, Massachusetts. And we know, because Mr. Rowley taught us about this, what happened in Salem, Massachusetts, the witch trials. And Nathaniel Hawthorne was born after they happened, but he has a relative who was actually a judge during the Salem witch trials. And we know how horrible the witch trials were. So Nathaniel Hawthorne actually felt very guilty about his family's involvement in killing people. So most of his stories focus around his dislike of religion and politics and how it hurts people. He's most famous for writing Young Goodman Brown, which we're not going to spend any time on. He's also famous for The Scarlet Letter. But what we are going to be reading in class is Dr. Heidegger's Experiment, which is one of my favorite short stories. And the final author we're going to talk about is kind of everyone's favorite, Edgar Allan Poe. So he was also born in Massachusetts. He wrote poems and short stories, but he's actually a Gothic writer. What made his story so dark was his life was terrible. Like when we look at his life, his mom died, his wife died, then he married his cousin and she died too. Like everyone in his life died. And actually his death is still kind of a mystery. We're not totally sure what happened and we know how he died, but we don't know why it happened. He is considered the father of detective stories, but not everybody agrees with that. But you'll see that a lot of his stories are very like mystery based. You probably are familiar with him writing things like The Telltale Heart and The Raven. And again, you're going to have some choices about what you want to read when it's time to study Gothicism. So what I want you to do is we're just going to do another check-in and then we'll be done. What are those 5 literary characteristics of Romanticism? If you have to go back a little bit in the video to see them, that's fine, but make sure you write them down because we need to memorize those.
Okay, so make sure you complete this assignment. Make sure you share everything with Miss Marks and I. And if you have any questions, please email us. Don't forget our Zoom hours are from 8 to 10 and 12 to 2, Monday through Thursday. So good luck, get to work, talk to you later.